David Lynn had never really imagined that he would one day become a secret agent. In fact, the idea was downright absurd. He'd always been more comfortable behind a computer screen, typing code, debugging software, and if he was honest, avoiding social interactions whenever possible. His life was a series of carefully calculated decisions, safe choices, and up until now absolutely no excitement. But then he had gotten the invitation. It came in the form of a neatly folded letter that appeared on his desk one unremarkable Wednesday morning. It was signed simply with the name Falcon. He had stared at it for a full 10 minutes, wondering if it was some kind of joke. Then, as if the universe had taken pity on him, the letter slid open, revealing a terse message: "We know what you can do. It's time you learned how to use it. Report to the address below." And so, his new life had begun. The training facility was unlike anything David had ever seen. It wasn't a sterile government building or some shadowy bunker, like the kind he had seen in movies. No, it was sleek and modern, with gleaming glass walls and high-tech security systems that hummed with quiet authority. When David stepped inside, he was greeted by an array of professionals, ex-spooks, cyber-intelligence agents, and military experts, all whispering in hushed voices as they exchanged notes on the latest assignments. But David, well, David was different. He was an outsider, a stranger to this world of covert operations and whispered secrets. He wasn't even sure why they'd picked him until they showed him what he could do. "David," Agent Falcon said, standing in front of him, his voice steady, professional. "You have a unique skill. One that makes you invaluable to us. We've been watching you for some time now." David felt his stomach churn. Watching him? That sounded ominous. I don't understand. What do you mean, watching me?" Falcon smiled, but it wasn't comforting. "Your ability to sense vibrations. You can pick up on subtle shifts in the air. It's a rare gift, but we've adapted it. You see, there are people out there who operate without making a sound. Assassins, spies, criminals who don't need to make a noise to be lethal. That's where you come in." David blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "I'm not a fighter. I'm just a software guy. A programmer." "We know. But this," Falcon said, tapping his temple, "is more powerful than any weapon. And you're going to learn how to use it." It wasn't until later that David realized what Falcon meant. They hooked him up to a strange series of devices, and, with a mix of hesitation and curiosity, David let them implant a small chip into the base of his skull. The procedure was almost painless, save for a few sharp stabs of discomfort, but when it was over, he felt different. Hyper-aware, like he could feel every molecule in the air buzzing around him. It was as if the world itself had become a symphony of vibrations. At first, it was disorienting. He could feel the walls, the floor, the air. Everything had a frequency, a hum. But soon, he started to tune into specific patterns. He could detect the faintest shift in the air caused by a passing footstep, the subtlest vibration caused by someone moving across the room. He could even sense the vibrations of objects that were out of sight, feeling their presence in the space around him. It was like a sixth sense, one that made everything and everyone in the room seem alive, vibrating with energy. "Relax," Falcon said, breaking David out of his reverie. "You'll learn to control it. Trust your instincts." And control it, David did. Over the course of several weeks, he honed his newfound ability. He learned to differentiate between vibrations caused by objects, people, and even the wind. He could pinpoint movement before it happened, track individuals through crowded rooms, and detect the faintest soundless threats long before they could reach him. And yet, there was something unsettling about it all. The more David delved into the training, the more he wondered about the world he was being thrust into. He wasn't sure who to trust, but he was certain of one thing: this was not the world he had signed up for. He had always imagined being a silent observer, a behind-the-scenes player in the digital world. Now, he was being trained to become a weapon. To hunt and be hunted. David's first field test came on a humid Thursday afternoon. He was tasked with tracking an assassin codenamed the Ghost. This killer had managed to elude capture for years, slipping through the cracks of multiple intelligence agencies, leaving only death in their wake. The Ghost was known for one thing: silence. They killed without leaving any trace, using stealth tactics that defied logic. David's mission was simple: find the Ghost before they could strike again. He was sent to a small, upscale cafe in the middle of the city, a place frequented by high-ranking officials and business magnates. The cafe had been selected as the next target, and David was the one assigned to intercept the assassin. He stood in the corner of the room, eyes closed, concentrating on the subtle hums and vibrations that surrounded him. At first, there was nothing. Just the normal ambient sounds of clinking coffee cups, murmurs of conversation, and the soft tap of shoes on the tiled floor. But then, something changed. A shift in the air. A ripple that felt almost too faint to notice. David's heart skipped a beat. There. He sensed it, his breath quickened as he followed the faint vibrations, pushing through the crowded cafe, past the noisy chatter of people unaware of the danger lurking around them. He moved like a shadow, no longer concerned with the world around him, only with the vibrations, the invisible signature left behind by his target. The closer he got, the stronger the vibrations became, until just as he was about to pinpoint the source, he felt something else. A vibration that was different from the rest. It wasn't a normal shift caused by movement or subtle changes in the AIR. It was aimed at him. A chill ran through David's spine. He froze, turning slowly, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. That was when he saw it: the assassin. Or rather, who the assassin was. It wasn't a stranger. It was him. Or rather, it was someone who seemed to be following him, tracking his every move. David's pulse raced. His own senses, honed to track others, had been turned against him. The vibrations that once seemed so comforting now felt like a prison. Everything he did was being watched, every step was anticipated, and then, just as quickly as the vibrations had appeared, they disappeared. David's head spun. Was it a test? He wondered. Had Falcon orchestrated this as part of his training? Or was there something more sinister at play? David's heart raced as he stared at the encrypted message. The target is you. The words burned in his mind, a cruel twist in a world that had already been upended. He read them again, just to make sure. His fingers shook slightly as he keyed in a response, but the moment the message left his device, a sudden chill gripped him. The room, once familiar, now felt suffocating. He tried to push aside the panic bubbling up inside him, but it was impossible. His mind reeled with questions. Who was trying to kill him? Why would someone target an unassuming programmer like him? More importantly, who in the world had known about the strange ability he'd developed? No one outside the agency knew about the implant, and even fewer understood how it worked. So, how had they found out? He couldn't afford to sit around speculating. Not anymore. The clock was ticking. David didn't even wait for Agent Falcon's instructions. Instead, he quickly grabbed his things, pulling on a jacket as he headed for the door. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. His mind flickered back to the events in the cafe, how his own ability had been turned against him. He hadn't been tracking the assassin at all, the assassin had been tracking him. The realization had hit him hard: this wasn't just a mission anymore. This was a game, and David was its pawn. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was from Agent Claire West, the woman who had been working alongside him. Claire had been the only one who seemed to believe in him after that close call in the cafe. He had trusted her, but now he wasn't so sure. Not after the message. Not after everything that had been happening. Could she be involved? Could she be the one pulling the strings? David hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. There was no time to be cautious. He opened the message: David, we need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot. Now that he didn't waste any more time. He left the apartment without hesitation, not even bothering to lock the door behind him. As he descended into the elevator, his mind raced. Was Claire part of it all? Was she in on whatever was happening, or was she truly trying to help him? He couldn't afford to second-guess himself, not anymore. David arrived at the alleyway behind a nondescript diner. The area was quiet, the kind of place where no one would notice someone slipping in or out. It was a place where no one asked questions. He had been here before, for briefings and clandestine meetings, but tonight, it felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he scanned the shadows. A movement caught his eye. Claire stepped out of the darkness, her face partially illuminated by the dim glow of a streetlight. She was dressed in a dark jacket, her expression unreadable. Without a word, she motioned for him to follow her. David's pulse quickened. He didn't trust anyone right now, not even her, but he had no choice but to play along. "I got your message," he said, keeping his voice low as he followed her through the alley. Claire glanced over her shoulder. "I didn't send it." David stopped dead in his tracks. "What do you mean you didn't send it? Then who?" "I'm not the one who's been tracking you, David," she cut him off. Her tone was sharp, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him pause. "I've been trying to protect you, but I've learned some things. Things I shouldn't have." David's mind whirled, but he forced himself to keep his thoughts focused. "Then what is going on? Why is someone trying to kill me? And who's behind this?" Claire took a deep breath, and for the first time since David had met her, she looked uncertain. She led him further into the alley, away from the streetlights. They stopped behind a rusty dumpster, and Claire looked around nervously. "Do you know about Apex Vision?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David frowned, the name gnawing at his memory. Apex Vision was a name that had come up in the agency's briefings. A high-tech corporation known for its innovations in artificial intelligence and bioengineering. But David had never heard anything sinister about them. "Until now, Apex Vision," he repeated. "What do they have to do with any of this?" "They're the ones behind everything," Claire said, her voice tight. "They're the ones who implanted you with that chip, David. The implant that gives you your abilities. And now, they've activated a program to eliminate you." David's stomach dropped. "What? No. That can't be." "It's true," Claire cut him off. "They've been watching you for a long time, David. They implanted the chip as part of an experiment. They've been experimenting on people with similar abilities for years, trying to create a network of human sensors. And you," she gestured to him with a mixture of disbelief and guilt. "You're the center of it all." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He was part of an experiment. A pawn in someone else's game. David staggered back, his mind reeling. "So, I'm just a test subject?" Claire nodded. "Yes. And now they want to clean up their mess. They want you gone." David's legs felt weak. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, pressing down on him with the weight of the realization. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what Claire was telling him. He'd always thought of himself as an average guy, someone who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But this was something else entirely. The vibrations. The strange ability he had developed. It had all been part of their plan. "Why didn't you tell me?" David's voice was hoarse, a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Why didn't you warn me?" Claire's expression faltered, and for a moment, she seemed unsure of herself. "Because I didn't know the full picture. I thought I was helping you, training you, teaching you how to use your abilities. But I didn't know Apex Vision's true agenda. I only found out recently. And I am trying to make things right." David clenched his fists, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He had been so focused on his own abilities, so blinded by the training and the secrecy of the agency, that he had never questioned who was pulling the strings. "So, the assassin, the one who's been tracking me, was hired by them?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Claire nodded, her eyes hardening. Yes. They've sent a professional, someone with similar abilities to yours. Someone who can track you just like you track others. The ghost, they call him. But I don't think he's the one you should be worried about. David's brow furrowed. Then who? Apex Vision, she said, her voice tight with urgency. They're controlling everything. And they've set their sights on you. They're using you as part of their plan to create the perfect network of operatives. A network of people with your abilities, each one tracking and eliminating anyone who stands in their way. David felt a wave of nausea sweep over him. The weight of it all, his abilities, his training, his mission had been a lie. He wasn't a hero, a soldier, or even a secret agent. He was a tool. A weapon. His eyes narrowed. I'm going to take them down. Every last one of them. Claire's gaze hardened. I'm with you. But we need to move fast. You're not safe here anymore. Apex Vision has people everywhere. David didn't need any more convincing. He had been living in a world of shadows for too long. Now, it was time to step into the light. David and Claire moved swiftly through the dimly lit streets, their footsteps muffled by the constant hum of the city. The cool night air bit at his skin, but David barely felt it. His mind was too consumed by the chaos that had been unleashed. Apex Vision. The ghost. The assassination attempts. The realization that everything he had been told, everything he had learned, had been a lie. He was just another pawn in a game much bigger than he could have ever imagined. Claire kept her pace steady ahead of him, glancing over her shoulder every few moments, but her posture was tense, like she, too, felt the weight of being hunted. They reached a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town, a forgotten relic tucked between towering steel structures and well-lit apartment complexes. The building wasn't much, just an old office complex that had been repurposed into a safe house for agents like Claire. Stay close, Claire whispered as she pushed open the door, leading him into the building's darkened interior. They moved through narrow corridors, each step echoing off the cracked walls. The place felt abandoned, a stark contrast to the sleek, polished training facility that David had grown accustomed to. Here, there were no distractions, just the smell of dust and old papers. Claire led David into a small room at the back. She flicked on a dim light overhead and immediately began scanning the area, checking the windows, the corners, and the locked filing cabinets. The room was simple, a table in the center, a couple of chairs, and a few crates stacked against the far wall. On one end of the table, a few loose documents were scattered haphazardly. I'll start making calls, Claire said, her voice steady but tight. She set her bag on the table and rummaged through it for her phone. I've got a few contacts who might be able to help us. But we need to be quick. Apex Vision's already onto us. They're probably tracking every movement we make. David nodded, though he didn't feel reassured. He felt exposed, more so than he ever had before. He wasn't just an ordinary man anymore, not with the vibrations that now flowed through him, constantly alerting him to the world around him. The feeling that he was being watched had never been more palpable than it was now. What about the ghost? David asked, his voice low. What do we do about him? Claire paused for a moment, her hand hovering over her phone. She looked at him with a mixture of concern and resolve. The ghost is dangerous, but he's not our biggest problem. Apex Vision is. They're the ones calling the shots, and they're the ones who've made you a target. If we're going to survive this, we need to take them down first. Everything else is secondary. David clenched his fists. It was hard to reconcile this new reality with the man he had been. He wasn't a fighter. He was a guy who sat in front of a screen all day, writing code, fixing bugs. Now, he was a target in a deadly game. And every instinct he had said that the ghost wasn't the only one out there. Apex Vision had the resources to send more than one assassin after him. I don't know if I'm ready for this, he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Claire looked at him for a moment, her expression softening. You're more ready than you think. It's not about being ready. It's about surviving. Trust me. You have what it takes. David didn't feel so sure. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Claire turned back to her phone, fingers tapping furiously against the screen. David could hear the hum of her voice as she spoke to someone on the other end. He let the words wash over him, though he didn't understand everything she said. There was too much to process. He stood by the window, watching the street below, waiting for something to break. The minutes ticked by. Finally, Claire hung up, tossing the phone onto the table. We've got a lead, she said, her eyes narrowing. But it's risky. Apex Vision's top security team is on the move, and they're already looking for us. We can't go to the main facility, it's too heavily guarded. But there's a smaller lab they've been operating out of, a place they've been using to conduct their experiments. It's off the grid, and it's not as well guarded. David turned to her, a sense of purpose rising in his chest. Then let's go. We can't waste any more time. Claire shook her head. Not yet. First, we need to plan. The ghost's been hunting you for a reason. He knows you can track him. He's probably already onto us, which means we'll need a distraction. We can't just charge in there and hope for the best. David nodded, his mind spinning. The thought of facing the ghost again, it felt like stepping into the lion's den. But Claire was right. He had to think strategically. You think you can hold him off? David asked, a flicker of doubt creeping in. Claire met his gaze, her eyes hardening. I won't have to. We'll lure him in. He's been hunting you because he knows you're a threat. But if we make him think you're vulnerable, we can turn the tables. It sounded simple in theory, but David knew better than to underestimate the ghost. This wasn't a normal assassin. He was a mirror of David, someone who knew how to sense every vibration in the air, someone who could track David just as easily as David could track him. But what choice did they have? Claire moved quickly, outlining the plan in rapid-fire terms. They'd create a false trail, make it look like David was alone, an easy target. Then, when the ghost made his move, they'd trap him. But it was risky, and there was no guarantee that it would work. The ghost was too unpredictable, too lethal. But at least they'd have a fighting chance. David's nerves were raw, but there was a strange clarity in his mind now. He wasn't just going to sit back and wait to be hunted. He wasn't going to be anyone's pawn anymore. The chips had fallen, and now it was time to make a move. As Claire continued preparing, gathering supplies and weapons, David focused inwardly, trying to center himself. The vibrations inside him were louder than ever, each shift and hum threatening to overwhelm his senses. It was difficult, but he began to focus on the patterns, learning to control the rhythm of his body, to make it all part of the plan. He wasn't just a tracker anymore. He wasn't just the hunted. He was the hunter. The hours passed in a blur of preparation, but soon, it was time to move. Claire gave David one last look, her face stoic as always. She seemed to be weighing something, a decision that David couldn't quite place. But there was no time for second-guessing now. They slipped out of the safe house under the cover of darkness, moving through the back alleys to avoid detection. David's senses were on high alert. He could feel the vibrations of the ground beneath his feet, the air moving around them. He could hear the distant hum of cars, the faintest whisper of wind through the trees. But there was something else, too. A low, constant thrum, something unnatural, someone close by. He stopped suddenly, causing Claire to halt just ahead of him. She turned to him, her brow furrowing in confusion. What is it? She whispered. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes, reaching out with his senses. The vibration was unmistakable now. It was coming from behind them. Someone was following them, the ghost. David's heart skipped a beat. He turned to Claire, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got company." Claire's expression hardened. "I knew it. Stay close, and don't make a sound." They moved quickly, ducking into a narrow alley and disappearing into the shadows. The city around them seemed to close in, a maze of corridors and hidden spaces that they had to navigate carefully. They weren't just escaping anymore, they were preparing for a fight. And this time, David wasn't going to let anyone take the first shot. David's heart was hammering in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He could feel the ghost's presence just beyond the alleyway, every tiny shift in the air a subtle declaration that the assassin was closing in. The vibrations that hummed through the walls and the ground had a distinct pattern, a predatory, methodical rhythm that made David's blood run cold. He could track the ghost just as easily as the ghost could track him, but now, in this dark, narrow alley, David wasn't just another prey. He wasn't going to be the hunted. He'd learned enough, trained enough, to know that the game had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted, and David intended to make sure the ghost knew it. "Stay low," David murmured to Claire, his voice barely audible. "Don't move unless I say so." Claire didn't question him. She just nodded, her eyes locked on him with a mixture of trust and urgency. They had been through enough together for David to know that she could keep her cool, even in the worst situations. But this? This was different. They had just reached the end of the alley, and David's senses were screaming at him to move faster. He could hear the faintest sound of boots on concrete. The ghost was drawing closer. The vibrations were stronger now, closer to the surface. The assassin was walking with deliberate speed, staying silent as always, knowing the moment he stepped into the alley, he'd have them both cornered. David gritted his teeth and looked over at Claire. He could see her bracing herself, her stance firm and ready. The vibrations underfoot were getting louder. The ghost was right there. A few more steps and he would cross into their zone. But they weren't going to wait for that moment. David's mind shifted into overdrive, working faster than it had ever worked before. He could feel the vibrations in the air, the subtle shift of energy around him. Everything was in motion, everything was connected. With a barely noticeable gesture, David motioned Claire to follow him, and they darted to the side, into a side door that led to a building's interior. The vibrations told him there was a space ahead, empty and still perfect for what he was planning. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and they were in darkness. The only sound was the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. David could feel the cool rush of air around him, but it did little to calm the storm in his mind. Claire was already ahead of him, moving quietly through the dark corridor, her eyes scanning for anything unusual. They were on the second floor now, hidden away in the maze of old offices and abandoned rooms. David could feel the building's pulse beneath his feet, the faint vibration of the walls, but there was something else too, something far more urgent. The ghost was still close. "I don't know how long we can stay hidden," Claire whispered, glancing back at him. "If he's as good as you say, he'll find us." David's mind raced, but he could feel the pull of the vibrations. They were becoming more pronounced. Something was changing in the air. The ghost had either found them or was about to. There was no more room for waiting, but he reached out with his senses. The vibrations were like a thread, a path that led him to the source of the noise. The ghost. The assassin wasn't just hunting, he was preparing to strike. David could feel the subtle changes in the air, like ripples spreading out. The ghost had learned how to move without making a sound, but David could read those tiny vibrations, those minute shifts in the energy around him. "He's here," David muttered under his breath, his voice low, but filled with certainty. Claire's hand went to the small pistol holstered at her side, her body tensing in preparation, but David held up a hand. "No," he said, his voice tight with control. "We don't need guns." She gave him a puzzled look, but he didn't explain. They had only one chance to do this, and guns wouldn't be enough. Not against someone who could anticipate every move. David let his focus narrow. The vibrations swirled around him, like an invisible web. The moment he found the thread, he knew he could pull it, unravel it, and throw the ghost off balance. If he could catch the assassin off guard, if he could manipulate the environment just enough, it would be the opening they needed. David breathed in slowly, pushing aside the fear that tried to creep up his spine. He didn't have time to second-guess himself. He could feel it now. The ghost was just on the other side of the wall. The faintest vibrations told him that much. The assassin wasn't moving. He was waiting for them to make a mistake. Without a word, David stepped toward the wall. It was a quiet, smooth movement. But in that moment, everything seemed to slow down. His heartbeat, the subtle hum of the building, the air around him, it all came into focus, and then he reached out with his senses. It was like stepping into another world. The vibrations around him, the hum of the room, the air, it all seemed to bend to his will. His focus sharpened, and the vibrations around the wall grew more pronounced. He could feel the smallest shifts in the air. He knew the ghost was on the other side, as sure as he could feel the beating of his own heart. But David wasn't just going to wait for the assassin to strike first. He extended his hand toward the wall, and, with a subtle push of his energy, the air shifted. A slight disturbance, a flicker in the current, moved through the space. The ghost would have felt it instantly. It was a trap. A signal. The moment the assassin reacted, moving in for the kill, David would have him. The vibrations flared as David felt the change. The assassin was no longer waiting. He was moving. Fast. David's hand jerked to the side, slamming into the wall and creating a ripple through the air. The vibration spread out, and in the split second before the ghost reached them, David pulled on the energy in the environment. The walls, the air, the floor, they all seemed to respond, vibrating in opposition to the ghost's movements, creating a shockwave that threw the assassin off balance. The ghost crashed against the opposite wall with a grunt, his form momentarily knocked out of alignment. It was just enough. David didn't hesitate. He sprang into action. With the vibrations now on his side, David moved faster than he ever had before. His senses were hyper-aware, every shift, every sound, every tiny movement screaming at him. He darted forward, using the disorientation from the shockwave to his advantage. Claire followed closely, her eyes locked on David, ready for whatever came next. The ghost recovered quickly, pushing himself back to his feet. But it was already too late. David had already anticipated his next move, reading the assassin's intentions before they even registered in his mind. The ghost had made the fatal mistake of underestimating David's ability to manipulate the very environment around him. David was no longer just reacting to the vibrations. He had learned how to control them, how to weaponize them. With a swift movement, David lunged at the ghost, his hands grasping the assassin's arm and twisting with the power of the vibrations flowing through his body. The force of the movement sent the ghost staggering backwards. For a moment, there was silence, then, the ghost's body went still. David stood there, his pulse pounding, sweat trickling down the back of his neck. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to win. Not like this. But it was over. The fight was over. David slowly released his grip on the assassin, feeling the energy drain from his limbs. He was still standing, but it felt like the ground had shifted under him. The world around him had tilted. He was no longer just a player in this deadly game. He had changed the rules. Claire stepped up beside him, her eyes scanning the room, her body tense. "Is it over?" David nodded, but he didn't feel the sense of victory he thought he would. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Apex Vision wasn't going to let him walk away so easily. The ghost was just one piece in a much bigger puzzle. "I don't know," David said quietly, his voice steady but uncertain. "But we're not finished yet." The vibrations under his feet didn't lie. Apex Vision was still out there. And they weren't done with him yet, but David was done waiting. It was time to take the fight to them.